The night Ida Cooper was turned away from the harvest social, the sky above Millhaven, Kansas, was the kind of deep, starlit black that made a person feel both very small and very alone. And she felt both of those things with a sharpness that cut straight through her ribs as she stood at the door of the town hall with her good dress on, and her chin held as high as she could manage. It was October of 1874, and the town of Millhaven sat at the edge of the rolling Kansas plains like a collection of hopes that had dried out and cracked a little in the sun. There was a general store, a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse during the week, a saloon that the reverend pretended did not exist, and enough stubborn, wind-burned people to fill all of it with noise and opinion. The harvest social was the biggest event of the year. Folks came from farms 10 and 15 miles out, women in their pressed calico and men in their good hats, and the whole of the town hall was hung with corn husks and dried sunflowers, and the smell of roasted pork and apple cider. It was the kind of evening that was supposed to make a person feel like they belonged to something. Ida had been telling herself for 3 weeks that she was going. She had pressed her dark blue dress herself, heated the iron on her small stove, and worked the creases out with careful hands. She had pinned her brown hair up neatly and borrowed a small comb with a mother-of-pearl inlay from her neighbor, Mrs. Beaumont, who had pressed it into her hands and said she looked lovely, and meant it. Ida was 31 years old, a widow of 2 years, and she had spent a considerable portion of those 2 years learning how to move through a town that looked at her with that particular mixture of pity and discomfort that widows seemed to generate in people who did not know what to do with grief that was not their own. Her husband, Thomas Cooper, had died in the spring of 1872, thrown from a horse during a bad storm when a crack of lightning split a cottonwood not 20 yards from where he was riding the north fence line. He had been a quiet, steady man who fixed things that were broken and never raised his voice, and had loved Ida in the simple, practical way that some men had of loving, which meant she had never doubted it, not once. His death had left her with a modest homestead 3 miles south of town, 40 acres of Kansas grass, a kitchen garden, 6 laying hens, and their daughter, Clara, who had just turned 8 in September and had her father's eyes and her mother's mouth, and an endless supply of questions about everything under the sun. Clara was spending the evening with Mrs. Beaumont, who had insisted on it, saying that Ida needed to get out among people, and that she had been rattling around that homestead like a dried seed in a gourd for long enough. Ida had laughed at that, the real kind of laugh, and kissed her daughter's forehead, and walked the 3 miles into Millhaven with the cold October air sharp on her cheeks and something fragile and hopeful turning over in her chest. She had not counted on Hester Grady. Hester Grady was the wife of Aldous Grady, who owned the feed store and served on the town committee, which meant that Hester had appointed herself the keeper of Millhaven's social calendar with all the authority and thoroughness of a circuit judge. She was a round-faced woman with small eyes and a voice that carried, and she was standing at the door of the town hall with a list in her hand and a smile that did not quite reach those small eyes when Ida walked up. "Ida Cooper," Hester said, and her voice had that particular brightness that people use when they are about to say something unkind and have decided to do it pleasantly. "Good evening, Hester," Ida said, and she kept her voice even. "You know, the harvest social is a paired event this year," Hester said, glancing at her list. "We announced it at the church meeting last Sunday, couples and families only. We simply cannot have single women attending unchaperoned. It disrupts the arrangements." Ida looked at her. The sounds of fiddle music and laughter came through the closed door of the town hall, warm and golden and unbearably close. "I was not at the church meeting last Sunday," she said. "Clara was ill." "Well," Hester said, and spread her hands in a gesture that was meant to suggest that this was deeply unfortunate but entirely out of her control. "I am sorry for the inconvenience, but we cannot make exceptions. It would set a precedent." The woman standing just behind Hester, a Mrs. Talbot whose husband owned the hardware store, looked away when Ida glanced at her. A man coming up behind Ida with his wife on his arm gave Ida a look that was almost sympathetic but not quite sympathetic enough to make him say anything, and he handed over his invitation and went inside. Ida stood at that door for a moment longer than she needed to, and the gap of time was not because she was deciding whether to argue. She had already decided she would not argue, because she understood with the bone-deep clarity that life had given her that arguing with Hester Grady in the doorway of the town hall would only produce more spectacle and less satisfaction, and she had too much dignity left to spend it that way. The moment was because she needed that breath to keep her face from doing something that would embarrass her. "Thank you for explaining," she said. She turned around and started walking. The road south out of Millhaven was nothing more than a packed dirt track that ran between fence lines and open grass, and at this hour it was dark enough that the stars did most of the work. It was a 3-mile walk. Ida had done it many times. She kept her chin up even though there was no one to see it, and she listened to the sound of her own footsteps and the faint, fading music from the town hall and the wide, windy quiet of the Kansas plains at night, and she told herself very firmly that she was not going to cry. She had made it perhaps half a mile from town when she heard the sound of a horse. It was a single rider, coming from the direction of Millhaven, moving at an easy trot that slowed as it drew near. She stepped to the side of the road without looking back, giving the horse room to pass, and pulled her shawl a little tighter. October nights on the prairie were not forgiving. The horse did not pass. It came alongside her and stopped, and she finally looked up, and she recognized Amos Whitaker. Amos Whitaker was not an easy man to miss even when you were not paying attention. He was 34 years old, lean and rangy in the way of men who had spent their lives working in the open, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been cut out of something harder than the usual material. He had a reputation in Millhaven that was hard to characterize simply, which is to say that people respected him without always knowing what to do with him. He ran a cattle operation 8 miles west of town, one of the better ones in the county, and he did not come to town more than he had to. And when he did, he was quiet in the manner of a man who had learned that most things people said were not worth responding to, but who occasionally said something himself that people remembered for a long time afterward. He was not married. He had come out to Millhaven from Texas 6 years ago, had bought the land and built the ranch up from almost nothing, and whatever he had left behind in Texas, he had left it completely, because he did not speak of it. The women of Millhaven had taken notice of him early on, but Amos Whitaker had a way of being present in a room without making himself available, and after a while people had accepted that he was one of those men who kept their own company and seemed satisfied with it. Ida did not know him well. She knew his name and his face, and the fact that he had once, during the bad blizzard of the previous winter, ridden out to check on 4 different homesteads in weather that would have turned back a sensible man, including hers, where he had left a side of salted pork on the porch without knocking. She had written him a note afterward. He had not responded to the note, which she had initially taken as rudeness until Mrs. Beaumont told her that was simply how he was, and that it meant no insult. He was looking down at her from his horse now with an expression she could not quite read in the dark, and he said, "Mrs. Cooper." "Mr. Whitaker," she said. There was a beat of silence in which the wind moved through the grass on either side of the road with a long, dry sound. "The social does not end for another 3 hours," he said. "So I have heard," she said. He was quiet for another moment. He looked at her, and then he looked in the direction of the town hall, and something moved through his expression that was not quite anger but was in the same family. "Did something happen?" he asked, and his voice was carefully neutral in the way that meant it was not neutral at all. Ida considered telling him it was nothing, which was what she had been prepared to say to anyone who asked. Something about the dark and the empty road and the fact that she was already tired of holding herself together made her say the truth instead. "Hester Grady turned me away at the door," she said. "Apparently it is a paired event this year. couples and families only. Amos Whitaker looked at her for a long moment. The horse shifted slightly beneath him, and he settled it with a slight movement of his hand that was so habitual he probably did not know he was doing it. "She turned you away," he said. "She did. In front of everyone." "There was a small audience, yes," Ida said, and her voice was admirably steady. Something in Amos Whitaker's jaw tightened. He looked away, down the dark road toward town and back at her. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, and he stopped and started again. "I should have come to get you first." Ida stared at him. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of dry grass and cold earth. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I should have come to get you first," he repeated, and there was something in the way he said it that was not an apology exactly, but was more serious than an apology, like a man stating a fact that he intended to do something about. "I knew you would be going alone. I thought about it. I did not act on it. That was a mistake on my part." Ida Cooper was not a woman who was easily rendered speechless. She had been managing a homestead alone for 2 years, raising a daughter, dealing with droughts and creditors, and a town full of well-meaning people whose help was often harder to navigate than the problems themselves. She had a practical, ordered mind, and she kept it working at all times because the alternative was falling apart, which she could not afford. But she stood on that dark road with her good blue dress and her borrowed hair comb and looked up at Amos Whitaker, and she could not find a single thing to say for a full 5 seconds. "You do not owe me an escort to anything," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "But Hester Grady owes you better than what she did, and I could have prevented it." He shifted in the saddle and looked down at her with those dark eyes and said, more quietly, "Can I give you a ride home, at least?" She should have said no. She was aware that it was the sort of thing that would give Millhaven's gossip circuit something to work with for a good 2 weeks. She was also 3 miles from home on a cold October night with a pair of good shoes that had not been designed for unpaved roads, and the small knot of wounded pride in her chest had been unexpectedly loosened by the simple, direct way this man had just spoken to her, and she was tired. "Thank you," she said. "I would appreciate that." He dismounted in one smooth motion and led his horse to the fence post long enough to take off his coat and drape it over the saddle, and then he helped her up with a steadiness and lack of ceremony that she appreciated more than she would have liked to admit. She had forgotten what it felt like to have someone be simply, quietly useful without making a performance of it. He swung up behind her and took the reins, and they started south along the road, and the night was very big around them, and the stars were very bright, and neither of them spoke for a while. "How long have you been in Kansas?" she asked eventually, because the silence was comfortable enough that she was not filling it out of nervousness, but because she was genuinely curious and had been for some time. 6 years, he said. "Came up from Texas in '68. "Texas," she said. "Whereabouts?" "Outside of San Antonio," he said. "East of the Medina River, different country from this. More rock, more cedar. The sky is bigger here, but the grass is different. Takes some getting used to." "Did you get used to it?" He considered this with the same seriousness that she had already noticed he applied to everything. "Mostly," he said. "I like it better in the spring. When the blue stem comes up and everything is green before the dry heat sets in. It reminds me less of a place I knew once and more of itself." Ida turned this over in her mind, the careful way he had put it. "That is a thoughtful way of saying it," she said. "It is the honest way," he said, and she had the impression that for Amos Whitaker those two things were the same. They rode in silence again for a while, and Ida watched the road unwind ahead of them in the faint starlight and thought about what an odd shape the evening had taken. She had expected embarrassment, and the long walk home, and the quiet ache of returning to a dark house, with a pride that had been dinged but not broken. She had not expected to be sitting on a horse with the warmth of another person at her back and the smell of horses and cold air and something like cedar soap, and to find that the ache had settled into something that was not as sharp. "Your daughter," Amos said. "She is well. She was ill last winter." Ida turned slightly surprised. "You remember that? You mentioned it in your note," he said. "After the blizzard, you said she had had a cough." "You did not respond to that note," she said, and she said it without accusation, just as a statement of the record. "No," he said, "I am not a good letter writer. I am sorry for that. It was not a slight." "Mrs. Beaumont told me as much," Ida said. "Mrs. Beaumont is a sensible woman," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been amusement. "She is," Ida agreed. "Clara is very well, thank you. She spent the evening with her. Clara would talk the ears off a brass statue given the opportunity, so she is probably still awake right now explaining to Mrs. Beaumont exactly how caterpillars become butterflies." Amos made a sound that was definitely amusement this time, low and brief. "How old is she?" "8. She will be 9 in the spring." Ida paused. She has a good deal to say about everything and is usually right, which makes it difficult to be irritated with her about it. "Sounds like her mother," he said, and the words were quiet but direct, and Ida felt the warmth of them before she had time to guard against it. She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing, and he did not push it, and they rode on through the October dark until the lights of her homestead came up on the left side of the road, the lamp she had left burning in the window, a small orange square against the black. He helped her down with the same unhurried steadiness, and she stood in front of her own gate and looked up at him where he sat on his horse and felt the strangeness of not wanting the ride to be over, which surprised her enough that she simply stood there for a moment without moving. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Amos," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. My name is Amos," he said. "You can use it." She considered him for a moment. "Thank you, Amos," she said. And then, because she was not a coward, and because something about this man made her want to be direct, "I hope I will see you again." He looked at her for a long moment, and in the starlight she could not read the whole of his expression, but she could read enough. "You will," he said. He turned the horse and rode back north toward Millhaven, and Ida stood at her gate and watched him go until the darkness swallowed the sound of the hoofbeats, and then she went inside to her small, warm house, and she sat down at her kitchen table, and she looked at her hands for a while. She was not sure what had happened. She knew that it was nothing, technically. A man had given a widow a ride home on a cold night, nothing more. But there was something in the way he had said, "I should have come to get you first," that she could not quite set aside. It had not been gallant, exactly. It had not been the performance of gallantry. It had been something more personal than that, something that suggested he had been thinking about her before that evening, that he had weighed something and made a decision he now considered to have been wrong, and was prepared to say so plainly. She had been around enough men who were not capable of that to know it was not common. She put more wood on the fire and took the pins out of her hair and went to bed, and she dreamed of the sound of hoofbeats and cold, open sky. And when she woke at dawn to let the hens out, she found that the ache in her chest from Hester Grady's door was almost entirely gone. Mrs. Beaumont brought Clara home after breakfast, and Clara came through the door at a full run and wrapped herself around Ida's middle and talked for 10 consecutive minutes about the baby rabbit that Mrs. Beaumont's dog had found under the porch. And then she stopped and looked at her mother with the unsettling perceptiveness that she had always had, even as a very small child. "Your eyes look different," Clara said. "They look the same as they always do," Ida said. "No," Clara said, studying her. "They look like you got a good sleep." Ida looked at her daughter and smiled and said nothing. Mrs. Beaumont was at the door with Clara's coat over her arm, and she looked at Ida with those sharp, kind eyes and said quietly, so Clara would not hear, "I heard what Hester Grady did." Ida's jaw tightened briefly. "Did everyone hear?" "In Millhaven, most likely." Mrs. Beaumont paused. "I also heard you were seen riding south out of town with Amos Whitaker." Ida raised an eyebrow. "Who saw that?" "Frank Talbot said he came out for some air and saw you, Mrs. Beaumont said, and she was working very hard to keep her expression neutral and not entirely succeeding. "He was kind enough to give me a ride home," Ida said. "Was he?" said Mrs. Beaumont, in the tone that meant she had a great many thoughts about this and was organizing them for later. "He was," Ida said firmly, and left it at that. Over the next week, Millhaven did what small towns do with a piece of information that has any social charge to it at all. which was to discuss it thoroughly from every available angle. Ida heard through the ordinary channels of gossip that Hester Grady had been criticized by more than a few people for what she had done at the door, including, notably, Pastor Hennessy, who had preached that Sunday on the subject of welcoming the stranger and the widow and the orphan, and had looked at the Grady family pew with considerable directness at the word widow. Aldous Grady had apparently come out of that service looking like a man who had a long afternoon ahead of him, and Hester had not been seen at the general store in 4 days. Ida did not feel triumphant about this. She felt tired of the whole thing, which was its own kind of answer. What she did not expect was for Amos Whitaker to appear at her gate on a Thursday morning 10 days after the social, on a gray morning when the sky was low, and the first serious cold of the season was moving in from the northwest. She was in the yard splitting wood, which was not particularly ladylike but which she had been doing herself for 2 years and was reasonably good at, and she looked up at the sound of a horse, and there he was, sitting easy on his black gelding at the gate with his hat in his hand, which meant he had taken it off before she saw him, which was a kind of courtesy she noticed. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She set the axe down and pushed her hair back. She was wearing her work clothes and was covered in wood chips and must have looked a considerable distance from the pressed blue dress of the social, but she did not find herself embarrassed by it. Something about Amos Whitaker made her think that looking like she had been working would not be a problem. "I wondered if I might talk with you a moment," he said. "You can come in," she said, and opened the gate. He tied his horse and came through, and she led him to the porch where there were 2 chairs that Thomas had built, and she poured him coffee from the pot she had kept on the stove, and they sat in the thin autumn light with the smell of cold air and wood smoke around them. "I want to say something to you," he said, holding the coffee cup in both hands, "and I want to say it plainly because I do not have much patience with saying things around the sides." "All right," she said. "What Hester Grady did was wrong," he said. "It was wrong not because of any rule that was broken, but because it was meant to make you feel small, and you are not small, and you did not deserve it. I have been thinking about it since that night, and it has bothered me more than I expected. Not just because I should have come to get you, though I believe that too, but because this town has a habit of deciding that a woman alone is either something to be pitied or something to be managed, and neither of those things is what you are." Ida looked at him. The morning light fell across his face, and she could see the lines around his eyes, and the set of his jaw, and the straightness of his back in the chair, and she thought about the fact that this man had ridden out to her farm during a blizzard without being asked, and had left a side of pork without requiring thanks, and had come here on a cold Thursday morning to say this to her, and she thought that she had not met many men who were made the way he was made. "You have given this a great deal of thought," she said. "Yes," he said, "I have." There was a pause in which the wind picked up and moved through the bare branches of the cottonwood at the edge of the yard. "Can I ask you why?" she said. He looked at her directly, the way he had on the road that night. "Because I have been paying attention to you for longer than I have let on," he said, "and because I think you are the most capable and the most honest person in this county, and I have been wanting to say that for some time." Ida set her coffee cup down carefully on the arm of her chair. "Amos," she said, "what are you saying to me?" "I am saying that I would like to come see you," he said, "properly, if you are willing. I am not asking for anything decided or settled right now. I am only asking if I can come see you." She looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of the 1,000 practical reasons that she should be cautious, that she had a daughter to think about, that she had managed on her own for 2 years, and had built a life in that time that worked, that grief was complicated, and remarriage was not a simple exchange. She was aware of all of it, and she filed it in the practical part of her mind where she kept things that needed thinking about, and she looked at Amos Whitaker on her porch with his hat on his knee and his dark eyes on her, and she said, "Yes. You can come see me." He exhaled just slightly, which told her that he had not been entirely certain of the answer, and that the question had cost him something to ask, and she found that this made her feel a great warmth toward him. "Thank you," he said. "You do not need to thank me," she said. "Yes, I do," he said quietly, and she let it stand. He came back the following Sunday, and this time Clara was home, and Ida had not entirely figured out how to introduce the situation before Amos was through the gate and Clara had appeared at the door and assessed him with those direct 8-year-old eyes and said, "You are very tall." Amos looked at her. "I am," he agreed. "My father was tall," Clara said. "Not quite as tall as you, but close." There was a beat, and Ida watched to see how he handled it because this was the test that she had not known she was applying until she saw it happening, and he passed it in a way she would not have predicted. He crouched down to her level, which made him considerably less imposing, and he said, "He sounds like he was a good man." Clara considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything. "He was," she said. "He knew how to fix things. Mama can fix most things too, but she has to use a book sometimes." Amos looked at Ida over Clara's head, and his expression was warm in a way she was not entirely prepared for. "That sounds like good sense to me," he said. Clara decided that this was an acceptable answer and went back inside, and Ida let out the breath she had been holding, and Amos stood back up and she said quietly, "She is very direct." "I noticed," he said, and he was smiling now properly, which she had not seen before, and it changed his face in a way that was difficult to look at for too long without feeling something. They sat at the kitchen table while Clara worked on her sums at the other end, and they talked. Really talked. The kind of talking that happens when two people are both intelligent and honest and have been a little lonely and have found someone worth the effort. He told her about the ranch, about the way the land had looked when he first bought it, about the two hands who worked for him, a young man named Cody Reeves who was 19 and still learning most things, and an older man named Del Haverford who had been on the trail drives and knew cattle the way other men knew scripture. She told him about the garden, about the difficulty of the previous summer's dry spell, about the hen she had named Josephine, who was by far the most opinionated of the six, and seemed to regard Ida as an employee rather than an owner. He laughed at Josephine, a real laugh, and it was a good laugh, deep and genuine, and Clara looked up from her sums at the sound of it with an expression that Ida saw and catalogued carefully. He stayed until the middle of the afternoon, and when he left he said he would come again next Sunday, and she said she would be here, and he smiled again, briefer this time but no less warm, and rode west toward his ranch, and Ida stood at the gate and watched him go just as she had the first time. Clara appeared at her elbow. "He has a good horse," she said. "He does," Ida agreed. "His eyes are nice," Clara said, and went back inside before Ida could respond to that which was possibly deliberate. He came the next Sunday, and the one after that. By the third Sunday he was helping with the woodpile without being asked, falling into it naturally the way a person does when a place begins to feel familiar, and Ida made no remark about it because it seemed to matter to him to be useful, and she understood that because she was the same way. By the fourth Sunday he and Clara were deep in a conversation about whether horses understood words or only sounds, a debate that Clara had strong opinions about, and that Amos engaged with the same careful seriousness he brought to everything. And Ida stood in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands and watched them, and felt something shift in her chest that she recognized, and was not ready to name yet, but could not entirely ignore. The first time he touched her, really touched her, was on a November afternoon when she was carrying a crate of preserves from the cellar to the kitchen, and her foot slipped on the icy cellar steps and he caught her, both hands at her elbows, and the crate did not fall and neither did she. And they stood in the cellar doorway for a moment with her heart hammering, and her hands gripping the crate and his hands at her elbows. And he looked at her with an expression that had all the restraint stripped from it for just that moment, and she could see clearly how much he cared about the fact that she had nearly fallen, and it was far more than politeness. "I am all right," she said. "I know," he said, and did not let go for another second. He helped her carry the crate in, and they did not speak of it, but she thought about it for a long time afterward. November moved into December with the relentlessness that Kansas winters have, the sky becoming a flat iron gray and the wind coming down off the plains with a cold that got into the bones and stayed there. And Amos came to see her twice a week now, once during the week when he could get away from the ranch and once on Sunday. And the town of Millhaven had things to say about it, and for the most part Ida did not care, because she had decided somewhere around the fourth or fifth visit that whatever this was, it was worth more than the opinion of people who had been happy enough to let Hester Grady turn her away from a door. It was Pastor Hennessy who came to see her in December, not to reprove her as she had half expected, but to sit at her table and drink her coffee and tell her, with a directness that she respected in him, that he thought Amos Whitaker was a man of character, and that the only thing people in this town had against him was that he kept to himself, and that was not a sin he was aware of. "You are giving me your blessing for something that has not happened," she said. "I am giving you my observation," he said, unperturbed. Amos came that Sunday with a book in his saddlebag, a copy of David Copperfield that he had carried from Texas and which was worn soft at the cover, and he gave it to Clara, who received it with a solemnity befitting the gift of a sacred object, and immediately began reading it at the table and did not emerge from it for 2 hours, which Ida considered a minor miracle. "She will not put that down for a week," she said to Amos quietly. "Good," he said simply. They were sitting on the porch despite the cold, because Clara was at the table, and they had developed a kind of unspoken agreement that the porch was where they talked without audience. The air was so cold it was crystalline, and the afternoon sky was that particular pale winter blue that seemed like it had been polished. "Tell me something about yourself," she said. "Something I do not know." He looked out at the frozen yard. "Like what?" "Anything," she said. "Anything real." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding how much to give. "When I first came out here," he said, "I did not expect to stay. I was coming through, or that was what I told myself." He paused. "I had been engaged to be married in Texas. She changed her mind 3 weeks before. I do not blame her for it. I want to be clear about that. I was not an easy man to know back then. I was very closed off, and I did not talk about things, and I think she could see that the life I was heading into was not the life she wanted." He glanced at Ida. "I came north after that. I bought the land because it was cheap and I needed something to do with myself, and I kept building on it because it turned out that was what I was good at, building things." Ida looked at him carefully. "You said you were very closed off," she said. "Past tense." He met her eyes. "Yes," he said, "past tense." She felt the warmth of that move through her despite the cold. "You are not easy to know," she said, "even now, but you are worth the knowing." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression was raw in a way she was not used to seeing from him. "Ida," he said, and his voice was quiet and steady and serious. "Yes," she said. "I think you know what I want to say to you," he said. "I think I do," she said. "Is it too soon?" he asked. And she could hear in the question that he meant it, that he was genuinely asking that he would wait as long as she needed. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the way grief worked, the way it did not really end but changed shape, the way it became something you carried differently over time, not lighter exactly but more familiar, more manageable, something you made room for without letting it be the only thing in the room. She thought about Clara at the kitchen table with her nose in a book. She thought about cold cellar stairs and warm hands at her elbows and Sunday afternoons that she had started looking forward to in a way she had not looked forward to anything for 2 years. "No," she said, "it is not too soon." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the cold porch in the winter light and did not need to say anything more for a while, and it was one of the better silences of her life. He asked her properly just after Christmas, on a clear cold day when the ground was frozen hard, and the cottonwood by the yard was bare and silver-white against the blue sky. He came to the house in the late morning and asked Clara, very formally, if he might speak with her mother alone for a few minutes, and Clara looked at him and looked at Ida and said, with the composure of a small judge. "You may speak on the porch," and went and found something to do in her room with enormous dignity. He did not kneel. He stood on the porch and held both her hands and looked at her with those direct dark eyes and said, "Ida Cooper, I would like very much to be your husband if you will have me. I want to take care of you, not because you cannot take care of yourself, because you clearly can, but because I want to be the person who does it with you. I want to be there, for you and for Clara if she will let me. I am not a perfect man and I do not pretend to be, but I am a steady one and I will not fail you." Ida felt her eyes fill, which she had not planned, and she blinked the feeling back and kept her voice clear. "That is the most honest proposal I have ever heard," she said. "It is the only one I intend to make," he said. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Amos, I will marry you." He let out a breath that seemed to have been held a very long time, and then he put his arms around her and held her, and she pressed her face into the front of his coat and felt the solid, real weight of him and the steadiness she had been drawn to from the beginning. And she thought that this was what it was supposed to feel like, not the desperate clinging of loneliness, but the choosing of something that made you more yourself, not less. Clara appeared at the door in a remarkably short time, which suggested she had been listening from approximately 6 inches away, and she said, without any preamble at all, "Did she say yes?" Amos looked down at her with a gravity he could not quite maintain. "She did," he said. Clara considered this. "Good," she said. "I already told Mrs. Beaumont you were going to ask, and she has been waiting to hear." Amos looked at Ida. Ida looked at Amos. "How long have you known?" Ida asked her daughter. "Since October," Clara said, "when you started sleeping better," and she disappeared back into the house before anyone could respond to that. The wedding was in February, a small ceremony in the church, because neither Ida nor Amos wanted a large production of it, and because February in Kansas was not the month for anything elaborate. Pastor Hennessy performed the service with warmth and a brevity that everyone appreciated, and the guests were few but genuinely happy. Mrs. Beaumont, who cried in the dignified way of a woman who has been waiting for something for months, Del Haverford and young Cody Reeves from the ranch, both of them scrubbed and uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes, and a handful of neighbors who had always been kind. Clara stood beside Ida and held her mother's hand during the ceremony, and near the end she reached over and took Amos's hand too, which was not planned, and which caused Mrs. Beaumont to cry harder and Amos to look down at Clara with an expression that Ida saw from the corner of her eye and which she would remember for the rest of her life. Ida wore the blue dress. She had pressed it again, with the same careful iron on the same small stove, and this time when she walked out in it, she was going towards something instead of away from it. Hester Grady was not invited and did not come, and no one remarked on her absence. After the ceremony there was a supper at Mrs. Beaumont's house, which was warm and loud and full of food, and Cody Reeves told a story about a steer that had once escaped its pen and wandered into the general store, and Clara laughed until she had to hold her sides, and Del Haverford, who was not a man of many words, leaned over at one point and said to Amos quietly, "You did well, son." And Amos said, "Yes, I did," with a certainty that was not arrogance but simply honesty, and Del nodded and went back to his supper. Moving to the ranch was a larger adjustment than Ida had anticipated, not because anything went wrong, but because the ranch was a different world from the homestead, bigger in scale and busier, and full of the rhythms of cattle and horses and the needs of a working operation. And she had always run her own place, and it took some time to understand how to run this one, which was already running when she arrived. Amos was patient about it in the way that he was patient about everything, which was not passive patience, but the kind that meant he paid attention and gave her room and trusted her to find her way. Within the first month she had reorganized the kitchen in a way that made Cody Reeves look briefly alarmed, and then concede that it actually worked better, and had discovered that the ranch kept appalling records of its supply inventory, which she corrected with a ledger book, and an efficiency that Del Haverford declared was better than anything they had managed in 6 years. Amos watched all of this with a quiet satisfaction that he did not always put into words, but that she could feel in the way he looked at her when she was working. Clara adapted to the ranch with the speed of a child who had been waiting for a larger canvas. She was fascinated by the horses and spent a great deal of time with them in a supervised way, because Amos had specific and serious opinions about children and horses and the proper order of learning. He began teaching her to ride in March, with a small steady mare named Biscuit who had the temperament of a grandmother, and Clara took to it with the combination of focus and fearlessness that characterized everything she did. Ida stood at the corral fence on a bright, cold March afternoon and watched Amos walk beside Biscuit with Clara on her back, his hand on the lead, his voice even and patient as he told Clara to sit up straight and breathe, and let the horse feel that she was not afraid. And she thought about the fact that 2 years ago she had been standing at a cellar, raising her daughter alone with both hands full and a wide, empty space beside her where Thomas had been. She thought about how grief had made everything feel permanently altered, permanently smaller. And she thought that she had not known it was possible to have this specifically, this man walking beside her daughter's horse in the March light, this life that was large again. She did not cry, because she was not standing close enough to the corral for anyone to see, so she let herself. Spring came to the Kansas plains in the way that spring comes there, all at once and with a fierceness that made the gray winter feel like something that had been dreamed. The bluestem came up green and the sky turned blue, and the air smelled of warm earth and new grass, and Ida planted her kitchen garden in the bed that Amos had broken for her near the south side of the house, twice the size of the one she had had at the homestead, and she put in tomatoes and beans and squash, and an enormous stand of sunflowers along the fence because she had always loved sunflowers and had never had enough room for them. She also discovered in April that she was pregnant. She told Amos on a quiet evening when Clara was in bed and they were sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and she said it simply and directly because she did not know another way to say things. He was very still for a moment and she watched him, and then he put his hands flat on the table and looked at her with an expression that she had never quite seen on his face before, something that was not composed or measured but simply open all the way down, and his voice when he spoke was not entirely steady. "Truly," he said. "Truly," she said. He stood up and came around the table and pulled her up and held her against him, and she could feel that he was breathing in a different way than usual, and she put her arms around him and held on, and they stood in the kitchen in the lamplight and did not say anything for a long time. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer heat came in hard, and Ida was sick in the mornings and tired in the afternoons, and the combination of managing a ranch and growing a person, and raising an increasingly tall and complicated 9-year-old was enough to test anyone. Amos took over the supply ledgers without being asked and told Cody Reeves to help Ida with anything she needed without her having to ask twice. And Cody Reeves, who was still learning most things but was fundamentally a kind young man, followed this instruction faithfully. Clara, informed in an age-appropriate way that there would be a baby in the winter, received this information with the same serious consideration she gave everything and then said, "I would like a brother," which Ida said she would pass along but could not promise, and which made Amos smile at the ceiling. Mrs. Beaumont came out to the ranch regularly through the summer and fall, ostensibly to help with sewing and preserving, but really to be useful in the way that she was always useful, which was to be warm and sensible and present. She and Ida sat on the porch on August evenings and shelled beans and talked about everything and about nothing, and sometimes about Thomas, because Ida found that she could talk about Thomas now without the weight being crushing, that she could hold him and hold this new life at the same time, and that this was not a betrayal of anything but simply the way life kept moving when you let it. Amos was a careful and attentive husband in the way that suited him, which was not demonstrative in public but deeply present in private, a man who noticed things and acted on what he noticed without requiring acknowledgement. He refilled her coffee before she asked. He fixed the loose step on the porch 3 days after she had mentioned it in passing. On the evenings when the heat was bad and she could not sleep, he was awake with her, and they sat on the dark porch and listened to the Kansas night and talked, or did not talk, and both were good. He told her more things over those months about himself, filling in the picture slowly the way you fill a room with furniture, piece by piece. He told her about his father, a hard man but not a cruel one, who had worked cattle all his life and died of a fever when Amos was 20, leaving him the only son with nothing but a quarter section of rock and cedar that he had sold to fund the move north. He told her about the long drives, the years he had spent on the trail before he bought his own land, the particular way the stars looked above the Texas hill country on a clear night, which he said was the only thing he genuinely missed. He told her that he had been lonelier than he had let himself fully know before her, and that knowing it now was strange and also good. She told him things, too. About the early years with Thomas, the way they had come out to Kansas together with almost nothing, and had built the homestead one board at a time. About the grief of Thomas's death, the way it had come in waves at first, and then had settled into something that was always there but differently shaped. About the fear she had had, the quiet, persistent fear, that she had used up whatever luck or grace had given her those first years, and that the life ahead would just be maintenance, just getting through, just being sufficient to what was required. "And now?" he asked. "Now I know that is not true," she said. He reached over in the dark and took her hand, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the Kansas night moved around them with all its stars and wind and enormous quiet. Their son was born on a December evening in 1875, 1 year and 2 months after the night of the harvest social, in the same bedroom of the ranch house, while Mrs. Beaumont assisted, and Amos paced the kitchen with a deliberateness that had Cody Reeves pressed against the far wall trying to be invisible. Clara sat on the kitchen bench with David Copperfield open on her lap, without reading a word of it. The baby arrived with a sound that changed the quality of the whole house, and Amos stopped pacing and stood very still. Mrs. Beaumont came to the kitchen door and said, "A boy, healthy, both of them fine." Amos went into the bedroom with the steadiness he always had, and then stood at the bedside looking at the small, red, furious creature that Ida held against her chest, and she looked up at him and he looked at the baby and then at her, and he was not composed at all, not even a little. His jaw was tight and his eyes were bright, and he sat down on the edge of the bed very carefully and put one hand over hers and said nothing, and she said, "Hello, Amos," in a soft voice that was meant to help him breathe, and he laughed a little unsteadily and pressed his forehead to hers. Clara appeared in the doorway. She looked at the baby with the focus of a scientist examining something significant. "He looks like a sweet potato," she said. "Clara," Ida said. "A very nice sweet potato," Clara said, and came to the bed and looked at him more closely. "What is his name?" Ida and Amos looked at each other. They had discussed names. "Thomas James Whitaker," Ida said. "Thomas for your father and James for Amos's father." Clara considered this for a long moment, and then she nodded, one firm nod, the verdict delivered. "That is a good name," she said. "Hello, Thomas." The baby, as if recognizing the formality of the occasion, stopped crying. Mrs. Beaumont, from the doorway, said something that sounded like it may have been a prayer but was also possibly just emotion, and went to make more coffee. The winter settled over the ranch, and the baby settled into their lives with the totality that babies have, filling every corner of the day with need and noise, and the particular vulnerability that made Amos, who was not a man given to hover with a subtlety that Ida found quietly wonderful. He took the night feedings without being asked, rising in the dark with a capability that suggested he had decided this was something he intended to do before the baby arrived, and he held the baby in the kitchen with the lamp low, and rocked him with a steadiness that probably helped both of them. Clara, for her part, was a devoted and opinionated older sister who had very specific ideas about how babies ought to be handled and communicated these ideas freely to everyone. Cody Reeves, who was 20 years old and had no experience with babies, was particularly targeted and learned more about infant care than he had bargained for in a way that probably served him well in later years. That spring, Amos had the ranch fence line extended on the north quarter, and he put in 2 more hands to manage the expanded herd, and the operation that had been a good one began to be a genuinely prosperous one. And Ida managed the books and the supply and the domestic administration of the whole thing with a thoroughness that Del Haverford said privately to Cody Reeves was the best thing that had happened to the ranch since the first good grass year. The second harvest social came in October of 1875, and this one was different. Amos mentioned it at breakfast one morning without preamble in the way he had. "The social is coming up," he said. "I want to take you." Ida looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "I remember the last harvest social," she said. "So do I," he said, and his voice had that particular quality it had when something had settled very firmly in him. "I want to take you this time. I want to walk into that building with you on my arm, and I want everyone in Millhaven to see that." There was a warmth to the deliberateness of it that she could not look away from. "Is that for my benefit or for Millhaven's?" she asked. "Both," he said honestly. She set her coffee cup down. "Then we will go," she said. They went. Ida wore the blue dress again, because it was her good dress and she saw no reason not to. And Amos wore his good coat and had even submitted to Cody Reeves trimming his hair, which he had offered to do with more confidence than skill, but which had come out reasonably well. Clara went to Mrs. Beaumont's with the baby, and they drove into Millhaven in the wagon in the October dark. The same October dark it had been a year before, and the same stars were out, and the music from the town hall was the same. Hester Grady was not at the door this year. The door was being managed by a cheerful man named Patterson who collected tickets with great efficiency and made no remarks about anyone's arrangements. Ida noted the absence of Hester without feeling triumphant about it, only a clean, quiet relief. Aldous Grady was inside, and he caught Ida's eye early in the evening and made his way over with the determined look of a man who had decided to do something uncomfortable and intended to get it done. He was not a bad man, Aldous Grady. He was a man who had been too accustomed to letting his wife make social decisions without examining them, which was a failure of character but not of heart, and the year had clearly done some work on him. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, and then corrected himself, which was a good sign. "Ida, I want to apologize for last year. What Hester did was wrong, and I should have been the one to say so at the time." Ida looked at him. "Thank you, Aldous," she said. "That means something." He nodded, relieved to have said it, and went back to his wife, who was standing across the room and who met Ida's eye briefly with an expression that was not exactly an apology but was not hostility either. Something more like a complicated acknowledgement that Ida accepted as sufficient, because she was not interested in enemies or in prolonged hostilities. Amos brought her a cup of cider and stood beside her at the edge of the room, and they watched the dancing, and she leaned into him slightly, the easy lean of a person who has found where they belong, and he put his hand at the small of her back in the quiet, steady way he had. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. "I thought you did not dance," she said. She had heard this from several people in town. "I did not say that," he said. "I said I had not had reason to." She looked at him and he was serious, and she smiled. "Then let us find out," she said. He was, it turned out, a perfectly adequate dancer who moved with the same deliberate, even quality he brought to everything, and who held her with the same steadiness, and who did not pretend to be something he was not, and did not need to be, because what he was more than enough. She put her hand on his shoulder, and he took her other hand, and they moved in the warm, noisy, fiddle-filled air of the town hall, and people around them danced and talked and laughed. And Amos looked at her the whole time with those dark eyes that saw everything, and she thought about the last time she had tried to walk into this building, and what it had felt like to be turned back. And she thought about the long walk in the cold and the sound of a horse, and a man who had said, "I should have come to get you first." She thought about all the things that had followed from that night, the Sunday visits and the cold porch and the warmth of a hand at her elbow on an icy step, and a proposal that was honest and a ceremony in the February cold, and a baby with his grandfather's name and a daughter on a mare named Biscuit learning to ride in the March light. "What are you thinking about?" Amos asked. "The road," she said. "Last October, walking home." He looked at her. "I thought about that night a great many times," he said. "About how I had sat at that ranch and thought about riding into town to get you, and did not do it, and then saw you walking home in the cold and felt like the biggest fool in the county." "You were not a fool," she said. "You were a man who had not yet decided what to do about something." "I had decided," he said. "I had just not acted." "Well," she said, "you acted." "I did," he said, "eventually." "I am glad you did," she said. He looked at her, and his expression was that open, unguarded thing that she had learned to recognize as what he looked like when he was not managing himself, when he was simply present and true. "So am I," he said. "Every day." They danced until the fiddle player took a rest, and then they stood at the edge of the room and talked with Dell Haverford's wife, a small, brisk woman named June who had come from Ohio and had opinions about everything and was right about most of it, and with Pastor Hennessy, who was deeply pleased about the whole shape of the evening in the way of a man whose sermon had been prescient, and with various neighbors from the surrounding farms who treated them with the easy warmth of people who had accepted them as a fixed part of the landscape. Near the end of the evening, when the cider was gone and the fiddle was playing slower things and the children who had been brought along were asleep in corners on improvised beds of coats, Amos took her hand and led her outside to stand on the step of the town hall, and the October night was the same as it had always been, dark and cold and star-filled, and the road south was visible as a pale strip in the darkness, the same road she had walked alone the year before. "I have been wanting to say something to you," he said. "All right," she said. He stood beside her and looked out at the road and then at her. "I am not always easy to know," he said. "I have always been aware of that. I spent a long time by myself and I got comfortable with it in a way that was probably not good for me. You made that harder to sustain. You and Clara, you made me want to be different, not different from myself, but more of it, more present, more willing to say what I mean." He paused. "I am not certain I am saying this well." "You are saying it exactly well," she said softly. "What I mean is," he said, "that I know this last year has not been simple. There was a great deal of change and a great deal of adjustment, and some of it was hard, and you managed all of it with a grace that I did not always deserve." "Amos," she said, "I am trying to tell you that I love you," he said. "That I love you, and that I am grateful for you, and that I intend to spend a very long time doing better at saying so." She looked up at him in the cold October night, and the stars were behind him, and the fiddle music was low from inside, and she thought about the woman who had stood here a year ago feeling turned away and small and alone, and she thought about how much could change in a year when the right kind of stubborn, steady, honest man decided to act. "I love you too," she said. "I have loved you since the cold porch in November, if I am being precise about it." He smiled, and it was the full smile, the one that changed his face. "I loved you before that," he said. "When?" she said. "The note," he said, "after the blizzard. You thanked me for the pork in that note, and at the end you said, 'Clara has named one of the hens after you. She says it is a compliment because Josephine is the cleverest of the six, but I thought you should know the name was not my idea. I read that 7 times. Ida stared at him. "You read a note about a chicken 7 times. "I read a note that told me who you were 7 times, he said. "The chicken was incidental." She laughed, and he laughed with her quietly in the cold October dark outside the town hall, and then he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood there for a while under the big Kansas sky, while the music played behind them. And the night was cold and the stars were bright, and the road south that she had walked alone a year ago was just a road now, nothing more. one of many that led in many directions from where she was standing, which was exactly where she wanted to be. They went back inside before the final dance and danced it together. And when the social ended and they drove home in the wagon through the cold night, Ida wrapped in the good wool blanket she had brought and Amos beside her with the reins easy in his hands. She looked at the road ahead and the stars above and the dark sleeping landscape of the Kansas plains and felt the full, specific, particular weight of a life that was good. Clara was still awake when they got back to the ranch, because Clara was constitutionally incapable of sleeping when something interesting was happening, and she had been at Mrs. Beaumont's with the window toward the road so she could see when they returned. Mrs. Beaumont had given up on bedtime approximately 2 hours prior, and they were both in the kitchen with hot milk and the David Copperfield, and Clara looked up when Amos and Ida came through the door and said, "Did you dance?" "We did," Ida said. "Good," Clara said. "I told Mrs. Beaumont you would." She looked at Amos. "Did you dance well?" "Adequately," Amos said. "He was better than adequate," Ida said. Clara accepted this verdict and went back to her book, and Mrs. Beaumont put on the kettle, and the baby made a small noise from the back room, and Ida went to him. And he was awake and looking up at the ceiling with the concentrated thoughtfulness of a very small person encountering existence. And she picked him up, and he settled against her shoulder, and she stood in the lamplight of the ranch that was her home, and listened to the kitchen sounds of her family. Amos appeared in the doorway of the room. He leaned against the frame and watched her with the baby and did not say anything, and she looked over at him and he was smiling, the quiet, real smile, and she thought that she would keep that image for the rest of her life, the way he looked at her then. 3 years after that October, in the autumn of 1877, when Thomas was 2 and beginning to discover both language and a determined interest in horses that Amos encouraged with visible delight, and Clara was nearly 12 and reading through everything in the county, and had announced her intention to be a school teacher, Ida sat in the kitchen one morning and wrote a letter. It was a long letter, and she took care with every word, and when it was done she read it through twice and changed 3 things and then sealed it. The letter was to Hester Grady. She had thought about it for a long time, longer than she would have admitted to anyone. Not because she needed Hester's approval or good opinion. She had stopped needing those things a long time ago. But because she had been thinking about the woman herself, the small-eyed, list-bearing woman at the door of the town hall, and she had come to the conclusion that whatever Hester Grady's motives had been that night, mean-spirited or self-important or simply thoughtless, the outcome had been that Ida Cooper had walked home alone on a cold night, and had been found by a man who said, "I should have come to get you first," and those words had changed the whole shape of her life. She was not grateful to Hester Grady for what she had done. That was not the spirit of the letter. But she was done being angry about it, and she wanted Hester to know that there was no ongoing hostility, no wound that was still bleeding, and that she wished her no ill, and that she hoped they could be neighbors without the awkwardness that had sat between them for 3 years. She gave the letter to Cody Reeves to take to town, and she did not think about it again. Hester Grady came to call at the ranch the following Thursday, which was not what Ida had expected. She came in her good coat with a covered dish that turned out to be apple cake, and she stood on the porch and was clearly uncomfortable and also clearly determined, and she said, with a directness that Ida had not known she was capable of, "I was unkind to you, and I have known it for 3 years. I want to tell you I am sorry, not because I deserve forgiveness but because it is the truth and I have been carrying it." Ida looked at her for a moment, and then she opened the door wider and said, "Come in and have some coffee." Hester Grady sat at Ida's kitchen table and drank Ida's coffee and ate apple cake with 2-year-old Thomas on the floor at their feet, who was systematically building a tower out of spools of thread he had found in the sewing basket, and they talked for an hour and a half, and it was not comfortable exactly, but it was real, and at the end of it Hester said, standing at the gate, "You have a beautiful family," with a simplicity that was genuine. "Thank you," Ida said. "So do you." It was not a friendship. They were too different for that, and too much had passed. But it was something, a small clear thing, an acknowledgement that people could be more than their worst moments if they were willing to try, and Ida had enough room in her life to hold that. She told Amos about it that evening, and he listened with the attentiveness he brought to everything she told him, and when she finished he said, "That was a generous thing to do." "It was a practical thing," she said. "I am tired of carrying it." "Most generous things are practical underneath," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that this was a man she could spend a whole life learning, and that the learning was always good. Thomas was speaking in full sentences by the following spring, and the sentences were frequently about horses and sometimes about biscuits and occasionally about his sister, who he called La because Clara was a syllable too many and he had decided it unilaterally. He followed Amos around the ranch yard with a focused determination that Amos bore with patient dignity, and which everyone else found deeply entertaining. Clara began helping with the younger children of some of the neighboring families that summer, teaching them their letters and numbers, and the families paid her in eggs and preserves, and once in a very good hunting knife that she accepted with the same gravity she brought to everything, and that Amos told Ida privately was going to be a very fine teacher. And Ida said she knew, and he said he thought so from the moment she told him he was very tall. In the summer of 1878, Ida found out she was pregnant again, and this time she was not as surprised and the news was easier to tell, and Amos did not need to sit down, although he did hold onto the porch railing for a moment. Thomas, informed of the new development in language he could understand, declared that he wanted a dog more than a sibling, which position he maintained for 3 months, and then abandoned entirely when his sister arrived in February. They named her Ruth Ellen Whitaker, which was Amos's mother's name, and she was born in a February that was gentler than the February of their wedding, and she arrived without the drama of her brother and looked around at the world with dark eyes that were startlingly like Amos's, which Clara pointed out immediately and then said, "She is going to be trouble," with the knowing tone of someone who was either prescient or projecting. Thomas forgot entirely about the dog within approximately 48 hours of his sister's arrival. The ranch in the years that followed was the kind of thing that people looked at from outside and called lucky, not knowing that luck was mostly what happened when a lot of work and a lot of honesty accumulated in one place over time. The cattle operation grew. Cody Reeves, who was 23 and had grown into a steadier and more capable man than his 19-year-old self had promised to be, took on more responsibility and became in effect a foreman. And Del Haverford stayed on because where else would he go? And because Amos Whitaker set a fair table and paid a fair wage and treated his people the way a man ought to. Ida's kitchen garden expanded every year, and eventually she began selling surplus produce to the general store, which became a modest income of her own that she kept in a separate ledger and used for the things she chose to use it for, including a new school primer for Clara and a very good pair of boots for Thomas, and eventually a rocking chair for the porch that she picked out herself from a catalog, and which was, she considered, one of the finest decisions she had ever made. She sat in that rocking chair on a September evening in 1880, when Clara was 15 and Thomas was 4, and Ruth was a year and a half and walking everywhere with the catastrophic enthusiasm of someone who has only recently acquired the skill. And the ranch was quiet in the particular way that evenings could be quiet when the day's work was done, and the children were fed, and the world had settled into itself. Amos came out to the porch and sat in the other chair beside her, the chair Thomas had built all those years ago, the one she had brought from the homestead, and she had placed his chair beside it, and they had sat in those 2 chairs together on evenings like this so many times that she could not count them. The sky to the west was doing the thing that Kansas skies did in September, burning orange and red and deep purple all the way down to the horizon, and the grass was silver gold in the last of the light, And somewhere out in the yard, Thomas was talking to the dog he had finally gotten, a brown and white hound named Captain, and Ruth was asleep inside. "This is a good evening," Amos said. "This is a good life," Ida said. He reached over and took her hand the same way he had on the porch in November of 1874, and she held his hand and rocked gently in the good chair, and watched the Kansas sky burn itself out into stars. And she thought about the night she had walked home from the harvest social in her good blue dress with her chin up and her heart dented, and no one beside her on the road. She thought about how the road had sounded under her shoes, the packed dirt of the Kansas track, and the cold in the air, and the music fading behind her. She thought about the sound of hoofbeats that had slowed and stopped. She thought about a man with his hat in his hand and dark eyes and a voice that was quiet and direct and which had said, without performance or calculation, "I should have come to get you first." She thought about all the things that sentence had turned out to mean. "What are you thinking?" Amos asked. He always asked this in the evenings, and she always told him the truth because that was the only currency they had ever traded in. "About the road," she said. "About that night." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about it too," he said, "more than you might expect." "Why?" she asked. He looked at the darkening sky, and she could see him finding the words the way he always found them, with the care of a man who did not spend them carelessly. "Because it is the night everything changed," he said. "Because I had been wanting to go to her, wanting to be where she was, and I had let my own uncertainty stop me, and then I found her on that road, walking, and I thought, this is what it costs. Uncertainty costs you this. It costs you the moment when you could have been there." He paused. "I do not want to cost myself moments any more." She looked at him, at the profile she knew as well as her own hand now, the jaw and the dark eyes and the hair that was just beginning to go gray at the temples, and she felt the full weight of what had been built here, the years and the seasons and the children and the work and the evenings and the arguments. Yes, they had had arguments. Two people of strong and honest character always did, and the reconciliations and the ordinary mornings and the extraordinary ones and everything between. "You have not," she said, "not once, not since that night." He turned to look at her, and his expression was the open one, the unguarded one, the one that meant he was simply there, completely there, with no distance. "Good," he said. Thomas came tearing across the yard with Captain at his heels and launched himself at the porch steps with a noise that scattered the evening quiet in all directions, and Amos caught him before he could bang into his mother's chair and swung him up onto his knee with a practiced ease, and Thomas grabbed Amos's arm and said, "Captain found a rabbit in the south fence," with the gravity of an urgent dispatch. "Did he catch it?" Amos asked. "No," Thomas said, disappointed but recovering. "But he was very close." "Better luck tomorrow," Amos said. And Thomas accepted this verdict and settled into his father's lap with the comfortable weight of a child who has never doubted where he belongs. And Ida watched the two of them in the last light of the September evening and felt the fullness of it, the good full weight of a life that had been built by two people who had chosen each other honestly and had not looked away. The stars came out one by one over the Kansas plains, the same stars they had always been, the same stars that had been over the road on that October night 6 years ago, and the grass moved in the quiet wind, and Captain came up the porch steps and settled at their feet with the satisfaction of a dog who has done his work for the day. And from inside the house came the small sound of Ruth stirring in her cradle, and Ida pressed Amos's hand once and rose to go to her. And he held her hand for just a moment before he let her go, the way he always did, keeping her and releasing her in the same motion, which was its own kind of love. She went through the door into the warm lamplight of her house, and behind her on the porch she could hear Amos beginning to tell Thomas the story of the first winter he had spent in Kansas, a story Thomas had heard many times and never tired of, and she stood for a moment in the doorway between the porch and the kitchen, and listened to the sound of her husband's voice telling her son a story in the dark, and to the baby's small waking sounds from the bedroom, and to the evening wind in the grass beyond the fence, and she thought, this is what it is. She went to her daughter and lifted her from the cradle and held her in the lamplight, the dark-eyed child with her father's serious face, and Ruth blinked up at her with the absolute trust of the very young, and Ida held her close and looked out the bedroom window at the stars over the Kansas plains, the same stars that had always been there. And she was not alone, and she was not small, and she was entirely, completely home.